Hello, gentle readers, fellow Earthlings. Today is April 20, 2025, Easter 2025. Happy Easter to you and yours. Easter is one of the major holidays in the Christian tradition, along with Christmas, signifying and marking the entry, as it were, of the central figure in Christianity, Jesus Christ. And then his ascendancy and transcendence of the flesh beyond ways of mere mortals, and in Christianity as the prophet and the Messiah as a singular figure, man, representing through his trials and through his teachings what was elegized as the gift of a higher power and the highest to humanity. So here it's kind of framed in the sense of the Old and New Testament, that the beginnings has that in the beginnings there was nothing, and then it was creation, as after a story for the creation is after nothing, and for the fundamental question of metaphysics is so arrived at here, and then out of the space from Genesis and geometry, and then in the book of John, as it were, in the beginning there's the word logos, as well as it's the word in Greek, and so more than just the word, but the discourse and the example of reason, and as essential the font of reason, the font of language, and the word, and then as with regard to that being the authority of the statement, that it's appreciated thusly that the technical import for an otherwise merely surveying of classical works is bearing information, knowledge, wisdom, that it is among this wisdom that this greatest, most printed work of all time, and as is held in the faith of Christianity as a holy thing and a singular kind of thing, sees that for then the relevance is as well that it starts as a treatise on what otherwise, without such means and mechanisms, has to be arrived at, and providing answers to these question words, the metaphysical and the higher and cerebral with regards to these things. See, I've been reading these books on the medieval philosophers. This is Copleston. Frederick Copleston, S.J., a Jesuit, was a historian in the 20th century. 15 Minutes of Fame, for example, is according to a televised debate against Bertrand Russell, where he was able to bring forth Russell's sort of hypocrisy with regards to kind of the exoteric and the esoteric, but largely known for these books, the history of philosophy. And so this one's about the medieval philosophers, and so the year 1200, say, or between the year 0 and today, about halfway. And so these two parts comprise this third volume in this series. And earlier there I was reading volume 4, which is kind of from Descartes to Leibniz, and the Renaissance thinkers and the rational Enlightenment and all that kind of stuff. But where these start is kind of right after the Islamic Golden Age, the Islamic Enlightenment, for Avempace and Averroes, these being kind of the Latin names for Ibn Hadbu, or I wouldn't really know. Some of the great thinkers like Avempace and Averroes of the Muslim Enlightenment, when that was the center of learning and in the world, and from who is derived a lot of these greater accounts. For example, Maimonides, one of the great members of the rabbinical tradition, was right after Avempace, and took a close reading of him, not so dissimilarly as to how in the learning and the following of the things that Baruch Spinoza was, as after Duns Scotus, also held up here as being important and having something unique that he said. The infinity is in, and as with regards to, then here it talks about these medieval philosophers, or as after, so this is after Aquinas and Duns Scotus. Those basically sort of making the end of what's called the scholastic tradition. Yet then what so follows these other later, what they call them, the doctors in the studies, and so these were, at least in large part, theological studies, but still at the same time having to, and toward the goal of the logic and the reason and the rationality, to bring two things together. One that's fundamentally sublime and profound to the point of being the unknowable and the ineffable. It's still the supreme and the omni, and the other is what attains to that for all that what truth, according to logic, can do for an ontology. And then here in these talks, that's basically attached as a briefest, merest silver thread of a teleology, then which has for reflection on all sorts of notions. And then the ontology as a logicist, positivisms, and then for the stronger mathematical Platonism, and much of the discussion of these medieval philosophers is as with regards to Plato and Aristotle, and what is Platonism, and then making for Aristotleanism. That these are the recycling these same arguments as from before, old wrapped as new, and all that kind of stuff. And the ontological, between this teleological and the ontological, that they're connected in one thing, and as insofar as that goes, necessary to each other and great for each other. And then here it's given that that for freedom of religion and freedom of thought associated, while there's some technical aspects that make for monotheism, and then that we can interpret all such other accounts as via this in a kind of universalist sort of sense, and then that the strengths of the religions, what people bind themselves to, includes that religion is its own voluntary attachment, and so and as well is able to attach with the compulsion and what's necessary in matters of belief or faith, that then enable one to make readings of such dogmas as, for example, transubstantiation, as being possible to accept those rationally and fully, and with the full complement of strong logicist positivism, strong mathematical Platonism, as an aside, yet as well for what is the semiotics, the meaning of these things, the epistemology, what is the definition, belief, and meaning of these things, that they can be so relayed and as of intersubjectively, and yet as well that then what were considered the transcendental of their truths just so happen to remain so, for matters of that being part of a philosophy, and as well with regards to notions like the spirit and absolutes in morality and ethics and these kinds of things. That goes to show that these medieval philosophers largely were in an era when it was entirely dogmatic and strictly enforced, that all this stuff was kind of given as that the teleological attachment was much greater and paramount. And that then as well, because some of the narratives from various people who would purport to interpret these kinds of notions conflicted, then that's where then much during this, but then much earlier also and much later also, that the analytical tradition vis-a-vis this idealistic tradition, which has to include these super things, and the analytical tradition basically dwindles to nothing, then they can still be together, and this way we can have kind of a rational enlightenment while still keeping the idealistic, because the idealistic then builds for these things of our mental senses, this object sense, number sense, word sense, time sense, and sense, the continuum, that otherwise end up lacking in plain pick them up and put them down empiricist, logicist positivism theories, only theories, which don't really have so much ontological weight to the ontological attachment to the ontological status otherwise. So that's just part of the considerations here of Logos 2000, 21st century discourse, and reflections on the word, and the meaning of words, and how it can arrive that from a metaphor, which may eventually fail in the universal logical and mathematical objects, that there can still be some sort of strong metonymy, which connects this Coleridge language to this Comenius language, for which is named, that's basically the truth, and all the truths, and all the truisms, as an affirmation or a negation, but what arrives at these things. One of the things is in the definitions is trying to define what's a higher order, a higher power. And so this is notions of the omni and the supreme and the deity. And so then some various definitions involved include whether it's negative things, not negative in the sense of aspersion, but negative in the sense of something that is not so. And then affirmations or affirmatory things, something that is so. So it's kind of like as with regards to the unstoppable force and the immovable object, there are once negative and affirmative statements about these things. It's an object that does not move. It's a force that does not stop. Whereas otherwise, when we have our notions of dissipation and attenuation, forces end. When there's the notions of oscillation and restitution, well, bodies don't move in these kinds of things, or they do. And so this just helps to affect or reflect on the physics then, as after the metaphysics, as after the undefinable, yet what's true, and that which is impredicative, yet which is true, as for the affirmatory and negatory of those. This Comenius language makes for negations, say, not done yet, not done yet, not done yet, that results in an affirmation as after that, the liar paradox, a simplest matter of quantification at all, that's the only logical paradox that need necessarily arrive from quantification. And then that just becomes a template of a prototype of what's fallacy or not true as a true thing itself, to compare then this whole, all these elements of the world of tertium and datur, yes, no, and not maybe, and yes, no, and not both, that at the same time this allows deliberation and contemplation to extricate that, and to result in something that's quite full for the theory, having a foundation already, and that thusly many such matters is in accordance with the sublime and the profound in this way, in the sublime, that which is greater than itself, is extraordinary again. And then that for matters of what people bind themselves to, what from an ontologist perspective is what they give their ontological commitment to, and that which is a matter of voluntary submission to, say, give like an enduring attachment or a permanent commitment, those are matters of the voluntary. And then was with regards to, and above, like institutions of society, which are matters of people in their minds and their commitments to each other, say. Then that, as regards also like to the higher order and spirit and such, is just given as matters of philosophy that everyone has, and that there's, well, a great freedom in it, and there's a great strength and power in it to deliberate on these things and contemplate these things and to believe in things, because it's always unfalsifiable the other way that something is not so, but that something supreme and omni is not so. Whereas, well, then what science provides is a great height of a measure of what would actually entail for something to establish itself as higher order and higher power beyond the merely natural, to what Duns Scotus might have put as the supernatural, and not just super, not just natural, supernatural. So yeah, reading these books, it gets into quite a cast of characters, as it were, and this one is part one is Ockham to the speculative mystics, and so this is after Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus, kind of the original scholastics, doctors of the church, after Eriugena and Roger Bacon, not Francis Bacon, Roger Bacon, and then Scotus Ariugena, who's not Duns Scotus, he's an Irishman of sorts, a few hundred years before that, in the time of Duns Scotus Ariugena, or excuse me, Scotus Ariugena and Roger Bacon, that these were monastic types during the kind of the Dark Ages, and so this is kind of the Middle Ages, and then also very well advised by the inputs from the Muslim Enlightenment. And so then as well, during this period is what was seen was the translations of Plato's works into Latin. And then that provided them to the wide European world of the Latinate that spoke and read Latin, vis-a-vis the availability of editions in Greek, or as of the Aramaic languages, for example, Hebrew. And so that goes to show that this fellow, for example, Ficinus, or Marcellius Ficinus, who translated Plato into Latin, then made for resulting the dissemination of knowledge and the studies and the surveys. And then as getting into Ockham, is like Ockham's a great nominalist, you might as well call him Plotinus too, and he was able to carry on a bunch of these things with regards to establishing the rational side, and also then the Euridico or the Juridico. The letter J didn't really exist, but then it was written I everywhere. But then as it's pronounced, that's the hard I, as it were, the J, then the juridical kind of arises from that in the considerations. And so Duns Scotus is kind of like the last of the scholastic and the highest of it. And then right before him, Thomas Aquinas really has set a blanket and a bed for all things Aristotelian and matters of rational thought. Then Ockham came again and it's just like, well, we're redoing the analytical tradition all again, and then also getting into some of these notions of the concepts of what is the humanist or significant changes in the dogma of the ultimately authoritative is with regards to the interpreted word of the diction of the laws given to man, as it were, or made by man. That it gets into Ockham sees kind of not just the usual idea that Occam's razor made for briefest deduction and also to keep things simple. That as well, it kind of keeps things too simple. And then getting into Ockham and the other considerations that it helps to establish there's a lot more going on than just these thinkers of just these times, yet as well that many of the later analytical versus idealistic accounts are just rehashing these same things. And so it's one of the first then that kind of survives as that all the deliberations about and around it survive. And so then it's not just the outcomes that are relevant, but the arguments and the contemplation and deliberation that goes into these kinds of notions, having that survive is more valuable than the end result or end product of kind of a polished, finished theory or theorem that without its greater surrounds is nothing more than a bauble to be picked up, admired for its features, forms, purpose, and function, and put back down. So looking through this a little bit, Copleston, he's talking about the 13th century of the intellectual field was the realization of a synthesis of reason and faith. And then here I'd read that as idealism, say. Philosophy and theology, and here I'd read that as teleology. Not so much to remove that which is the theological in the matters of faith, but to establish a place for it on its own grounds, and is not so related to this tertium non datur excluded middle that one or the other one of them would have to fail. So in that sense, then, as after there's a greater logicist positivism given a greater mathematical Platonism, then it can be a greater teleological account on its own course, but that still has to then keep satisfying all the rest of things. And then it can do so as for matters of interpretation and the deeper meanings of these matters of ideology, and then as well the transcendent in these things. Copleston says, strictly speaking, of course, one should speak of syntheses rather than of a synthesis, since the thought of this 13th century cannot legitimately be characterized with reference to one system alone, but the great systems of the period were, in spite of their differences, united by the acceptance of common principles. So these principles include, for example, Aristotelian contradiction. Here, for example, from the inverse contradiction bit last time, it's like, well, that's subsumed in this inverse contradiction instead, in the end runaround bit. So some of these common principles, like Aristotelian principles, make for that mostly also it's only kind of a half account, and as after induction is well defined, that it's only after deduction that this infinite induction is well defined. And so these are some of these common principles which we can still build easily that have been supplanted underneath in the foundations, deeper foundations, richer foundations, fuller foundations of the square of opposition and a square of fulfillment. And so that thusly it's possible to employ both sides of the square of opposition, yet to fully realize their potentials is a matter of higher discourse. The great achievement, the 13th century, positive constructive thinkers. So reflecting on that, what we see today as a logicist positive Carnot school is just old wrapped as new. It's great, though. It's old wrapped as new as after then dealing with existentialism and nihilism instead of being and the greater being and the questions of metaphysics, but it is just rewriting those for each other and sort of watered down in a bit. Who at the same time were agreed in accepting fundamental metaphysical principles and the mind's power of transcending phenomena and extending metaphysical truth. Scotus, who he'd say Duns Scotus, for example, may have criticized St. Thomas's doctrines of knowledge and analogy in certain points, but he criticized it in what he regarded, rightly or wrongly, as the interest of objectivity of knowledge and of metaphysical speculation. He considered that St. Thomas had to be corrected or supplemented in certain points, but he had no intention of criticizing the metaphysical foundations of Thomism. So here it's given that it has been given, and it's claimed as part of there's an ontological attachment to its ontological status, that the metaphysical principles are more as after Hegel's being and nothing, and this infraconsistent dually dialectic elements of the theory that make to arrive at what these metaphysical principles are not just Aristotelianism and some of Plato's ideals. That there's a greater account, and so Aquinas had a great Aristotelian account, but it's kind of a half account, and it kind of needs to be picked up instead of like having those, and it's split up in all these different thinkers representing all these different arguments and schools and developments and their directions. And so Aquinas it has some metaphysical aspects is determined by Aristotle, and then they're largely noumenological, only as after the phenomenological. And so without fulfilling that greater and wider noumenological for the phenomenological, that's not saying that Aquinas wasn't a very rational guy, and explaining for the analytical tradition very much so what makes a very, very firm grounds from what was given as to what could be given is for the analytical account. It's merely that it's not quite so completely as so that what was given could be considered a very an utmost full account of that. Metaphysical foundations of Thomism, or of undermining the objective character of philosophic speculation. Well, he said that there was more than what Aquinas was willing to admit. Again, St. Thomas may have thought that more must be allowed to the unaided power of the human reason than was allowed to it by St. Bonaventure, and this speaks to like Bonaventure, Albert the Great, Peter of Abelard, the sentences of Peter of Abelard, those being kind of like a monadology, or as with regards to much later after Augustine in the City of God and this kind of stuff about good and evil, and way before stuff like original sin, though, that being in a Christian sense, is about like Calvin and all that, which I really don't accept very much at all. And that I kind of accept Lutheranism and Protestantism as an exercise in freedom, but not so much Calvinism as original sin is that's a position that I don't hold. And so the Bonaventure, though, is pretty great. And Abelard was a little constrained, and it's not quite the same thing as like the monadology about Leibniz's account of a theoretical account of spirit in the intellect, that and as regards to the intellect, and then for those matters that Peter's statements were definitely very dogmatic and as well rational, and then Bonaventure was pretty much positive about these kinds of things, positive in the sense of holding them up as what he admired and found valuable in them, and is not so much as with regards to positivism making a statement. And then Aquinas affirmed a half account of Aristotleanism, which everybody could agree to and not have to think too hard. And then Duns Scotus made, for some of these accounts, it's like, this is infinity is in, and so it's staying. And even though then that breaks some of the half accounts, because as soon as you place that into the inductive counts everywhere, they can be broken right away. That then there's establishing that then, yes, we make for this deductive account for the classical expositions of the supraclassical, like Heraclitus, but mostly Zeno, and then for the accounts of what would be the supraclassical, like Democritus and Adams, or Archimedes and the infinite, and these kinds of things, vis-a-vis Pythagorean, which is just classical and linear, and an inductive account suffices, and these kinds of things. And Euclid's geometry could be said to give at least one superclassical object a circle, as something that was more than the animal in man, firm mind. That then getting on this reading, it's after Aquinas and Duns Scotus. Those basically establishing that the analytical tradition or the scholastic tradition was very Aristotelian, and then Platonic, and then much of the rest of the arguments and the people consider are talking about Platonism vis-a-vis Aristotelianism, and then phenomenalism and these kinds of ideas that there's not really an ontological attachment. Then also in the medieval philosophers, one thing they get into is these other ideas of the intellect. And let's see if I can kind of pick up what I had picked up from that in reading it. And it talks about the differences between church and state and these kinds of things. And Copleston says, the assertion that the most important philosophical event in medieval philosophy was the discovery by the Christian West of the more or less complete works of Aristotle is an assertion which could, I think, be defended. So Aristotle is the authority. So, for example, when you got like McKeon's Aristotle over here, and it's kind of after Hegel's Wissenschaft der Logik, it is so. Since the times of the Greek idealism and into the German idealism, those reflecting kind of these two promontories of the what's considered the most thorough account of all these sort of technical analytic things, making for a technical analogical, where the logical is true, right? And that it's well-founded. And some of these accounts that were given away in the course of the analytical tradition to remain adherent to the maxims and the principles of the analytical tradition, while yet so fulfilling that, yeah, in the greater, wider dialectic account, there's not much given to that instead. And then we have to make recourse to mathematics and geometry after logic to get what's real and true. And then this axiomless natural geometry makes for Euclid's classical constructions and then demands for Zeno's accounts, making them so. So that's a lot of what's been talked about here. And Logos 2000 and moment and motion, and then as after this descriptive differential dynamics is a deconstructive account of mathematics writ large, that being for strong mathematical Platonism, and then getting into the analytical tradition, what can be given an ontological status, of course, kind of agnostic in the sense of what it were, of all the things that would be attached to that in the human condition, beyond that we are humans, and that thinking beings and feeling beings would have the same sort of availability of both of these accounts as one account. Aristotle's prior and posterior, the being from being and nothing, or nothing and being, all these things kind of from a wellspring of philosophy that then, with regards to other ontological commitments or beliefs, that they bring all the strength to that. That in a negative account that the deity can never be known or understood, yet it can never be denied, or any kind of negative account. In the affirmative account that it's super and it's omni in all the possible ways it could be, that there is at least then that one that it would be this ideal that's being considered for the analytic tradition to have any ontological status at all. Which it does, of course, because matters of rationality align with matters of reason, align with matters of mathematics and logic, which are true from a strong mathematical universe hypothesis, a strong mathematical Platonism, strong logicist positivism, is after a word and the means of discourse to arrive at the idea of these plastic, metal, and concrete numbers that are also the names, that this strong metonymy arrives, so that way there can be a consistent theory of all the things. And so Copleston, he's studying the work of the translators. And so I was looking at the bibliography a bit here. When the integral Aristotelians, or Latin Averroists, after Ibn Averroes, who was an Aristotelian and brought that, maintained that the intellect is one in all men, and then getting into matters of the soul and the intellect and its mortality and these kinds of things, sort of super scientific. So there are many various arguments and attachments to like what makes demonstrable via reason the existence and substance, or the essence of a higher order and higher power. And so is generally as what may be defined as being super scientific or all scientific. And so in that sense, it is as all scientific, then there's nothing that the analytical tradition does except give credence. Again, though, that's not necessarily a position one need assume or make an attachment to still keep most of that. And as far as what may be inferred, all of that. The position adopted by the integral Aristotelians applied a radical separation between theology and philosophy. The technical philosophy and the philosophy of theology has that theology is a sort of philosophy. And so the actual being of deity is theology is just kind of its appreciation of that and in awe and respect of that. So what he's saying though is that some of the ideas of the supreme and omni, the powers thereof, are given to the analytical tradition to make treatments. And as for like apologetics of the dogma and this kind of thing, because they were being abused mostly, because it was given that once something established that this was rule one and see rule one, then all these different kinds of actors would want to ascribe the translation of what that is. And so the analytic tradition basically said is saying, hey, everybody has got the same tool set. And then that the Aristotelian tradition in the prior analytics kind of starts that way. It's like, and all the same thing is kind of work, and you can just call that Aristotelian if you only have a half account to give, and won't let more. Yet as well that it was given that otherwise the arguments about the authority of reason would just simply destroy what would be considered as not true. So that just helps to establish it in the dogma of the time as what survives in this philosophical account, and some of which is considered liturgical or part of the holy doctrine of these religions, that this is not necessarily then so much always the for the masses, yet, and by that I mean the masses of people, for all the peoples, because they wouldn't necessarily be subject to these influences. Yet the idea of that being part of what resulted, that it could be broadcast, all the ideas about them that became so justified were very much about making it so that the lay person who established their own grounds for inference and was aware of technical philosophy and logic would also be able to find these avenues of the reconciliation of otherwise what would make a great sundering of what would be possible. So in that sense, the this sort of Reformation is bringing together then for what are these like various councils of the various fragments of the Christian churches, or basically Orthodoxy and Catholicism, later Protestantism, and the many and various sorts. That this was basically just after Augustine, who was a Platonist, and knew Aristotle, and then after this the Great Enlightenment of the Muslim Enlightenment, and that bringing together, including with the Hebraical or rabbinical tradition, that being the idea and the word of lending the authority and the credence from reason, or a rational enlightenment, that then this gets into the setting up the stage for both making a very, very thorough and supporting structure for all these matters and tenets of dogma and reason together. That led then into the rational enlightenment and of Europe, and then into later into sort of the modern age. Again, time and again, telling the same sort of stories, given an ideological position to an analytical position, and then back and forth, sort of growing to where all this is old wrapped as new again and again, to get to where it's what results as the package of this theory, that and all the arguments together is still all of its pieces and its parts, and within it is all the pieces and its parts that makes so that then pretty simply, at least from the outset for the superclassical and reasoning, then it can be given all the way along something that's compatible with all these different things at once, while exploring that they don't agree, why they don't agree, this being then for a matter of apologetics, that being merely to explain something that was held, and why it can be considered that it was rational at the time to be held, when really at the same time it can no longer be so defended today. And as regards to why that we confiscate from these accounts in a sense, and provide apologetics for all the great old that we keep that's wrapped as new, all together as one thing. And so there's much discussion about Aristotelianism And then here there's discussion that Aristotelianism is a fuller Aristotelianism. So when you read Aristotelianism, that doesn't necessarily mean a fuller dialectic. And so a lot of the thinkers that you might associate with the logicist positivism entirely, some would aver that they're subject to their own limits of their half account of Aristotelianism, and by not admitting deduction, and that more further being necessary for the relevant, and not even talking about quasi-modal logic or other vacillations of the hypocritical, but just the account of fuller Aristotelianism, that this dialectic is not just a square of opposition, the square of fulfillment and satisfaction. So that goes to help establish that that's as well a concept that can be found in these thinkers, and it's very much commonsensical and part of the intuitive account of reasoners, and then for that gaining this ontological credence to get this ontological status is a necessarily high bar to keep it from being easily broken, even though it's easily broken. And so that self-contained accounts can at least be self-contained and self-consistent. That at the same time, when there's the wider world of all the things, that there's yet is a self-contained account that's self-consistent or infra-consistent, that remains this greater truth overall. So hopefully that helps express a little bit why the analytical tradition and the idealistic tradition have been broken and put back together many times. The intuitionistic and the constructivist have been broken and put back together many times. The Platonists and the positivists have been broken apart and put back together many times. So they do that. They are for each other, and neither could exist without the other. Overall, there could be brief partial accounts and fragments, but then all remain would there be fragments or extensions. They do not complete themselves in that manner. They complete each other, and so that's the usual notion of these talks here. So he's talking about 13th century, the 14th century, the Via Moderna, the modern road. Modernity opposed the realism of the earlier schools and became known as the nominalists. See, this detachment from realism for nominalism is a good thing, because it's like, well, we're going to separate our little theory from all the rest of what it could be attached to from this greater theory, and keep things simple and self-contained and a bit insulated from otherwise these realistic accounts, which have to explain everything. But now it's not just so much because the data and theory of science has began to become quite fundamental, and here that's even a bit unrolled with regards to mechanics and the superclassical in these bits. That the nominalism is a way of saying keeping things simple, and it's good for establishing kind of the criteria for something that can be relayed in a complete form. Yet then when that's put out for something like quasi-modal logic, in this, it's like, well, now just you can't. It's not so much, don't look beyond the edges because it's only defined out to the edges, but it's like, if you do, now it's wrong, compared to if you do, it's undefined. That's one of the strengths of some of the methods and applications, is that, if it's in the box, it stays in the box, and it's in the box, it stays in the box. But also one of the weaknesses of this merely partial analytical inductive half account, because its error mode is catastrophic, say. So that's again, these are things known by everybody, at least with a sufficient introduction and command of the language of science and philosophy, and and the modes of inference, and seeing the results, and making or at least reading and following, making the derivations that arrive at all these things, the theories all together, that's what I found is the most compelling way to go about it without being contradictory overall. And certainly, as far as I can perceive of the veracity to which it appertains, this appurtenance of this apparatus is entirely thorough. The principle of sufficient and thorough reason. He says, philosophy can hardly live without the analytic and critical spirit. Oh, sure it can. Philosophy can be anti-analytic and anti-critical. He says, at least critical analysis is one of the moments of philosophic thought, and it is natural that it should follow a period of constructive synthesis. And so he qualifies the fact that overgeneralizations are generally unsound. And so when they occur, it's because they have to be extraordinary in some sense to make them as like so. And then when they are so, then it's still so that overgeneralizations under it are generally unsound. That's why there's only fragments or extensions of a model of integers, for example. And this makes for at least 3 laws of large numbers, for example, which is simply not available to the merely partial half account. Yet or so. But in Sophia words are made so. And so it's profound and sublime. That's one of the great takeaways from Kant, who kind of like Kant right before Hegel, is that Plato's right before Aristotle, say. And so you might almost have that, although Plato preceded Aristotle and it's in a kind of combined development, then you might also have Kant as after Hegel. Because Hegel establishes kind of the metaphysical recurrence of Plato and a more full discussion for what Hegel brings as, and as for the dialectic included, that then Kant gives more as up of after the analytical account, or the Aristotelian in this sense, for the arguments of the treatments of these things. That Kant's sublime, though, it relates also to the Ding on Sich and some of these other concepts like Aristotle's vacuum or the unmoved mover. Then Kant has got the Ding on Sich, the thing in itself, and the sublime, that which is more than itself. And so those are kind of super classical as with regards to those still being references to what these things are when they're encountered. And then, so Hegel and Plato kind of sit there together, and yet Hegel was kind of more critically rational, and Aristotle was a bit more critically rational with regards to the great ideals, is after Plato and in a sense Kant. So they echo each other, but it's not exactly so that they're said they're the same. And like Carnap and the logicist positive school echoes, it repeats verbatim in many cases, this Ockhamism, or what it is, which says nothing in most of its accounts, except some things, and then as with regards to other things, and then what gets picked up later by the big guns like Hobbes and not Locke so much, but Hobbes and that of the moral, as it may so be called, philosophy, yet as with regards to systems of government and justifications of these things, spheres of justice, spheres of influence. Then though that there are ways to kind of read this as a narrative overall, with the goal of arriving at what can be a mathematical logic and a logical mathematics to make for a mathematical universe hypothesis can be so fulfilled. So the same principles except some deeper ones. The same consequences except some greater ones. The same guarantees of inference except some further demands. These are the usual kinds of accounts that make for logic that's not merely portable and not merely simple, and not merely intersubjective and to be easily relayed, but resistant to meddling, strong, and thusly not subject so much, yet still subject to stipulations that are unjustified. Overall, a wider theory. When William of Ockham tackles the subject of universals, he places the emphasis on the logical aspects of the question on the suppositio and significatio terminorum, rather than on the ontological aspects. Ockham seems to have been convinced of his fidelity to the exigencies of the Aristotelian logic, and one can even say that it was in the name of the Aristotelian logic, or of what he regarded as such, that Ockham criticized the metaphysics of predecessors like Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas. See, this goes to show that the simple, merely inductive half accounts are invincibly ignorant. Without providing any changes to their suppositions, there mean no changes to their outcome. And it's not a tenet of that sort of reasoning that there are any other ones at all. Yet, this is the idea that the ideals of metaphysics arrive at that there are this greater, wider, fuller dialectic, that the sphere of, or square of opposition does have a square of fulfillment and satisfaction that arises, and as to why that it's not merely so that the merely partial half account can be true altogether by itself. So it's so that Copleston here is reflecting on that it's not necessarily given, if he didn't make it explicit, that Ockham would have really recounted this, or if he was just leveraging the power of this great authority of this world culture to then make these things. And so then, to get a little bit beyond when we're talking about the Aristotelian logic, vis-a-vis something like the Aristotelian ethics and these kinds of things, as regards to the Platonic considerations of deity and the nature of the higher, or the omni and the supreme, there's some considerations as regards to the demands, role, and that Ockham also wrote up some stuff that you later see in Nietzsche, basically. And so these as well might have been, that this is part of the greater account of Ockham, is not just the attachment to simplistic results in Occam's razor, as with regards to a comment about Occam's beard many talks ago, but also then the stuff that would not be justified, but building a bunch of stuff with regards to ethics and morals. And so that before the Italian Platonist school, as after Miracourt and Otricourt, and anti-Aristotelians, which would be in rejection of some of these things. And they're mentioned Plato and Plotinus. Ockham read a lot of Plotinus. And then this Marsilius Ficinus, who has very, very much helped bring the Platonic. And then there's some talk of Montaigne, and I've seen a couple different, very different views on Montaigne with regards to whether he was speaking for or against the freedom of thought. It's almost, you can find something like on the wiki that's in its perspective or slant entirely the opposite of what I read from Montaigne in his essays at all. So that's one of these examples of something that would be kind of opposite what would be taken from it. Similarly to so as about Petrus Ramus, who is kind of like he brought Aristotelian versus Platonistic accounts, and then you can read from some articles that is kind of like the opposite of what his effect was or what his role was when these things were being considered, as with regards to what is said he talked about or said, that through the lens there's lenses and there are fabrications, and a fabrication isn't necessarily a lie, but a lie is necessarily a fabrication. A new idea of education by means of classical literature rather than by abstract philosophy was taking shape. This is accessible. The idea is that literature can convey stories that would exhaust the patience or interest of those who would learn reason, or be demonstrated, be things that take people who could dedicate their whole lives to philosophy for a lifetime to convey the concepts, these kinds of things. Talks about the Renaissance. Some that are characterized by a marked speculative trait which sometimes manifested itself in fanciful and bizarre ideas. Varied. Nicholas Cusa to Giordano Bruno. These were thinkers of quite widely varying acceptances or rejections of the dogma, and quite scattergoried, for example, in the case of Bruno, yet holistic in thinking about the things, at least. It's difficult to find philosophers who've kind of maintained and were lucked out to get on a good course, having solid educations to begin. So all these scholars started with having strong and solid educations in classically, and then having opportunities and giving them themselves to continue on those studies. Then at some perspectives varied many different ways in their developmental stages of their philosophical maturity, where others were very much constant and able to just grow and build these things out, even when it was beyond what was given to them. The thinkers, the integrators, the synthesizers, vis-a-vis the experimenters and the explorers and the doubters, in a sense, that it takes all kinds is kind of the thing, and the different phases of the mental development, the philosophical development, all have their role in the overall description of the mental development and the philosophical development. Even the spiritual development. It's a journey, is the usual idea. The bizarre and fantastic aspects of some of these philosophies may tend to make one impatient of them and their authors. But they are of importance in that they mark the rise of a new direction of interest, and because of the fact that they formed a kind of mental background against which the purely scientific study of nature could go forward. Indeed, it was against the background of these philosophies, which were the ancestors of philosophies like those of Spinoza and Leibniz, rather than against the background of 14th century Ockhamism, that the great advances of the scientific phase of the Renaissance were achieved. Not infrequently, the philosophers anticipated speculatively hypotheses which the physicists were to verify or confirm. Even Newton, it may be remembered, looked upon himself as a philosopher. And see, that's kind of generous, because this is the same guy who said hypotheses non fingo, and it's like, well, Newton, hypotheses non fingo. And he said amicus Plato, yet really I just like what arrives as true more. And it's like, it's okay. And then Einstein gave a pretty good account of the difference between a philosopher and a physicist, and that it's both, and yet at the same time to relay intersubjectively, particularly those whose bounds are constrained and thus more easily fulfilled within inductive account. The physicists with logicist positivism, that they need each other to result in success. It talks about the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Renaissance scholars. Up to Suarez. And then Suarez kind of gets then back into the Suarez and Mersenne and Arnauld with Descartes in the middle. And then Descartes, it was just like a wellspring of these things. And as well, he had access to all these results. And so he was able to incorporate a lot of that together. and it's one thing to approach these extraordinary fundamentals, and that anybody can just kind of arrive at that. But then being able to attach that to all the great thinkers of the time, and then of the times, is nothing less than what makes it possible to attempt to relay a higher order notion as natural and as given, justifiable, and as so simply. So yeah, then otherwise what I took out of these books was Ficinus and Petrus Ramus, and then as otherwise with regards to, I'm already a fan of Duns Scotus, and that then I'd be looking for where that is to be read as after Averroism or from Avempace, but it kind of sticks out as that's like the Kantian in the sublime is there, and so then when it's kind of further reified and made a more particular in the analytic tradition where it lives, instead of kind of as just a natural sort of result of antagonism, this a mutual antagonism. This way, the thinkers of this medieval philosophy provided all that philosophy really had to give for quite a long time, and then that later, and then until today in the 20th century, when logicist positivism could stipulate to itself that it had entirely abandoned any necessity for any of these ideological accounts and idealism at all, it's kind of made and made strongly in yet what is relatable is an analytical account that is not so, to just make sure that then for this combined strong mathematical Platonism and strong logicist positivism, for a strong mathematical universe hypothesis that is indistinguishable from a strong teleology, and it's so far as nothing can be found wrong with it at all. So that's usually sort of given, and then trying to figure out how to get that is kind of the ideas of the philosophies and the dogmas, is that this is what's been being attempted to be given, is these sorts of approaches to an attachment, and that's such a necessary thing to voluntarily submit to an ontological status, that it's given its own place in its own particulars, not merely for the fleeting human condition, but for the whole thing. So that's a nice thing. Well, gentle readers, I sure so hope you have a great day. It's breezy outside. It's sunny. Warm regards.